I'm continuing with my series Where to Put Your Pieces, and in the last video I looked at a game by the Swedish Grandmaster Ulf Andersson, and I'd like to look at another of his games. Here he has black and he plays one of his favourite systems, and that is the accelerated dragon with black. When I say one of his favourite systems, in the sense that it's related to the hedgehog, which he has been one of the great exponents, actually with both white and black. So this game was played in the German Bundesliga in 2004. Andersson is black against Sergei Krivoshey. So here's the accelerated dragon, and the difference between this position and a normal hedgehog is that black does not have the pawn on e6. It's difficult to play the pawn there with the bishop on g7 because the d6 pawn will be too weak. Now that means that the d5 square is sometimes available for white's knight, and personally that's why I've never been too keen on playing this system as black. I feel that black is just a little bit too cramped. And I don't like the fact that white can very often hop in with this knight. But let's see how Andersson copes with that. Apart from that, that is the only difference in the pawn structure between this and a regular hedgehog. But anyway, that's a discussion for another time. So Andersson exchanges on d4. Well, it's probably a good idea to trade those pieces, otherwise black is very cramped. And the standard continuation here is to play bishop d7 and then the bishop c6, attacking the pawn on e4. And after, let's say, f3, then black plays a5, and the point of that is to secure control over b4, which in turn means that black has greater control over c5. So very often this knight will hop round to d7 and then to c5, so it gives black a kind of foothold in the centre. But Andersson goes a different way and he plays bishop e6, and white plays very aggressively. You don't have to do this, you could play, let's say, queen d2, but white is provoked by bishop e6 and sees nothing wrong with advancing the f pawn. Well, it's a very logical move because we might be able to gain a tempo to play pawn to f5, but this has pros and cons, as we're about to see. Nevertheless, I think f4 in this position is actually justified. a6. It's a very difficult position. Black is intending to, at some point, well, possibly even immediately, advance with b5 to chip away at white's centre and gain some counterplay. And white has a difficult task of how to actually cope with this. In this game, Krivoshey decides to play b3, which looks like one of those, super solid moves, and looks quite reasonable, because if b5, I think this could probably be taken straight away. If not, then possibly c5 as well. But it kind of has a chunky feel to it. Nevertheless, I think this isn't the most accurate way to play. There was a game that Krivoshey played in a simultaneous display that I found in the database, where Krivoshey ploughed on with f5 and here played a4. Now this is absolutely typical Krivoshey. He loves a space advantage and was brilliant at exploiting the space and knowing exactly how to push it. a4 obviously clamps down on b5, and you can see what he's playing very ambitiously. And after this, he exchanged bishops and played a5. So this is a really grand clamp that white has on the position. So it means that if the knight sits on e5, then actually here the queen goes to d4, and as b6 is controlled, then it's quite difficult for black to actually organise counterplay. But Krivoshey plays b3, looks solid, but to me that's a kind of hesitant move actually. Well, having said that, after rook c8, now white doesn't hesitate. He plays g4. Clearly he feels that Andersson's play has been too slow and just wants to go for it on the king's side with these moves. Now, is g4 justified? At this moment you kind of say, well, of course, this looks fantastic. Where is black's counterplay? You know, these pawns are steaming down the board to drive black backwards. Doesn't this look fantastic? Well, let's see how Andersson copes with this. Well, first of all, he preempts the move f5 and just puts the bishop back on d7. This is a beautiful move because very often this bishop will just come back to c6 to hit e4 and find a much better square than e6, certainly a more secure square. Yeah, after f5, bishop c6 looks very natural. And the point is that having vacated d7, that knight can now spin round to e5. So Krivoshey played g5 first. Now I understand that because he doesn't want the knight going back to d7. So the knight has to go back to this seemingly very poor square on e8. But don't worry too much for black in this position. Whose king looks safer here? Black's still has all these pawns in front of it. I'm counting all 5 pawns. Whereas white's king looks a bit drafty. Now at the moment there's no problem at all. However, if black ever manages to counterattack, then the king could suffer. At some moment you might find that white wants to return these pawns to f2 and g2. f5, white ploughs on. Now you might like to have a think. How are you going to cope with white's attack? So if you want to pause the video here and just think how you're going to cope. Okay, I'm going to continue now. Well, Andersson took on d4. An idea I had was to play rook c5, giving up the exchange. And it seems to me that if white grabs that exchange, then black has a wonderful point for the bishop on d4. And the bishop on c6 also looks very well placed, slashing down towards white's king. And you know, there are going to be chances to open up the position here. This knight could bounce around via d6 or g7. Very good compensation for black. Of course, it's not necessary to take the rook. Nevertheless, it looks reasonable. I mean, who knows, it could transpose to the game. Instead, Andersson took on d4. And now he played rook c5. And this is brilliant. So the rook looks at some very sensitive points across the 5th rank. So it's not so easy for white to advance when this rook might chop off a pawn on g5 or f5. So for example, after knight d5, then e6 is a good idea. And after this check, this is already looking a little bit problematic for white. Suddenly that rook has come here, that bishop looks amazing here, and there's a threat to take this pawn. Looks very nice for black. So for the moment white held his position, played bishop d3, covering the f5 pawn, but now the rook sank itself on e5. This is a beautiful square because it's secure on e5. If white could dislodge that rook with the knight, would be a different story, but that knight, you can see, is very far away from the rook. So for the moment white can't go anywhere because advancing the pawn will allow rook takes. So he builds up on the f file, it's logical, but now, well, it seems as though Andersson had very little space, but now he counterattacks with f6. White would like to play h4 to hold those pawns, but actually in this case, you can see e6 is a very nice move, opening up the queen's diagonal, and of course f6 is impossible because rook would take the pawn. So white exchanged on f6, and now you can see black is fighting back. The knight finds a good solid square. So remember, minor pieces like to have solid protection. Rook g2, fine. Black is trying to get at the king. Now, how many of you would play king g7? Not so great. One never knows when it could be significant that the queen is on the same line as the king. Instead he plays bishop e8, which looks, you know, like a passive retreat. Actually, this bishop is going to find a nice square on f7, but also it means that the king can nudge to the side, and then the g file could be used for a rook. Knight d5. Now, black has to be careful. Exchange that knight off, and suddenly the bishop comes into play. Instead, king h8. No panic. Rook f1, okay, looks logical. Bishop f7. And now white decides to exchange on f6, which I think is reasonable, because at least after this exchange, then black's d-pawn is isolated. And now, if white ever exchanges on g6, you can see, again, nicely protected minor piece, pressure here. But after rook f4, well, I mean, I would assess this position as about equal. The rook on e5 doesn't win the game. It does, however, solidify black's position. But, you know, both sides have weaknesses here. So it looks level. Instead, white played bishop c2. And Andersson built up. And rook d8, defending the d-pawn. So here it still looks roughly level. White exchanged on g6. And now there was a blunder. I can imagine that this was the time pressure phase, because white lunged here. I think the best thing to do is to improve the position of the king, as Andersson did, by putting the king in the corner. Remember, there could be a counterattack on the g file at some moment. Could play king h1, but it's on a light square and one never knows. So I think h3 looks like a good move to me, with the idea of putting the king on h2. On this square, I think it's more secure. Position roughly level. Instead, white lunged with c5, and this is simply a tactical mistake. Obviously, he thought that, you know, rook takes would allow queen takes, and obviously there's a pin on the d file as well. But black has rook g8, threatening something here that has to be defended, and now black simply takes on c5, and there's no pin. So, well, Andersson has won a pawn. His technique is very good. First of all, he defends that. He doesn't exchange too early. Keeps some pressure, and suddenly that's pawn number 2. And this is a nice move. He's prepared rook g5. Clearly, this is still rather dangerous. But having put the rook on g5, then he can exchange pieces. And of course, this involves some calculation, because after rook takes, well, black's attack is simply too strong here. And queen takes was a move played in the game, but this liquidates into a winning king and pawn endgame. If king takes, then rook g8 and you exchange rooks, or rook takes and This also liquidates to a winning king and pawn endgame. So, well, the game was slightly cut short in a way by this blunder c5. Nevertheless, in this position, you can see how brilliantly Andersson has found his feet, all to do with that maneuver of the rook to e5. He recognised that that was a safe square, but also a key square, and that with the rook on that beautiful central point, it had chances to counterattack here and also puts pressure on that e-pawn. This position is roughly level, but still, I think a brilliant defensive performance by Ulf Andersson. And as I said, I would highly recommend playing through his games in the Hedgehog, obviously a related system, if you want to understand about beautiful piece placement, not just with the black side but also with the white side as well. He's played some great games. So remember, if you want to get instant notification of the next video, then please do subscribe, and don't forget to click the bell and check the box that says instant notification. Thanks for watching.